so I've been building products for almost 17 years now. And I've just been lucky to move through companies in different sizes, spaces, and complexities. So and a lot of that has now resulted in actually aaj ka jo session that I wanted to take is slightly more selfish. I'm trying to build a framework with which either people who are senior leaders in companies or startups can help make decisions which are slightly ambiguous in nature but faster, right? And so I've been doing this for the past 3 months now, having off the cuff conversations with several startups, and I've realized about 60 to 70% of them, उनका first decision ही wrong रहता है. Like because they come up with questions to me like, hey Bhavik, can I, how do I build this feature, or how do I hire this team, or how do I sort of like think about this GTM. And in the first 45 to 50 minutes the entire conversation generally is about, hey यार तुम problem क्या solve करने की कोशिश कर रहे हो, and what is your success metric. I think by the time that they sort of define the success metric, in the last 15 minutes I've seen there's been a heavy pivot on the choice that they've made either in the business or in the strategy. And I'll walk you through a couple of examples that I've come through. Okay. Some of this, given that some of y'all seem seasoned campaigners, some of this might feel basic. So stop me wherever you think is irrelevant for you. And wherever you all want to know more, I can give you examples of cases I've seen which might be relevant to you in some way or another, right? So let's just diving in. We covered this, right? Like mostly, who am I? Why am I telling you about decisions? I think through serendipity, I've worked through either 0 to 1 or at scale at 1 to 10, and now at PayU, I've been working at almost 0 to 100. Right, we started off at I remember pre-COVID, or we had just merged two entities together, Lazypay and PaySense. One was a BNPL entity, and the other was a digital loans entity. And as soon as COVID hit us, PaySense sort of saw massive defaults because of loan moratorium and such. And she effectively just got handed with a really bad playbook, and we had already committed numbers post merger to process, and it was an interesting journey. How do you innovate in a completely different market and also start hitting revenue numbers at a very strong cliff? In fact, I remember when I had started, we had some product market fit on BNPL, the retail version, but it wasn't enough. Like we were doing almost $2 to $3 million of revenue, which is not much, and significantly negative double-digit losses. And from then, last financial year, we actually turned about $100 million in revenue, and we are profitable. So it's been an interesting journey of several different decisions at a macro level, at a strategy level, and also at a product level. And we can talk through some of them. I've actually been trying to run this framework through different people, mostly product managers, people who do strategy at companies, etc., etc. But somehow I felt that people who get pained the most from low data, but having to make a hard decision, like for example, pivoting. When do you scale your product? How do you sort of like, do you build or buy your tech stack? Decisions like that. I think it felt more relevant to entrepreneurs. So recently I've been talking to more early stage founders to see if it makes sense to them. And the major commonalities in all of these problems are that very low data at the beginning, right? Like, and the cost of making a wrong decision tends to be extremely high unless you are extremely well capitalized to begin with itself. And even then, I think expectations are set the moment you raise money from the market. So how do you avoid those situations? Obviously there is no guru mantra to do it correctly, but there is a visual way that I have figured out tends to work, and that's what I'll walk you through. Taking a break, although one thing that I noticed in most of the companies that I worked in, but also from talking to people, 90% of all strategic decisions, like if you were to see all the decisions that are made in the company, in fact 80 to 90% would be individual in nature, right? But all strategy related decisions are taken by groups of people, right? And even if they are taken by small groups of people in early stage startups, what tends to happen in larger organizations that you have to get multiple groups of people around operations, sales, marketing to align with you. And whether or not they say yes, we would do it, the problem tends to be that they actually don't, right? And that's why aligning a massive group of people when you're making a decision is such a unique thing to, I think it's not that much of a soft skill. Also, it's almost like the necessity of running a large business. Some of the things that I've learned as cheats, right? Like when you're running, like for example, when I joined the company, we were almost 150 or 200 people, but and fairly small, right? I think the product team had barely 3 people, and from then we are almost 700. And I think what's changed is that there are so many different stakeholders, each one of them with over 2 decades of experience in the market. How do you make sure that everybody aligns to one area? These are 4 cheats, right? One of them I've realized is interesting. Um, a, a lot of people tend to talk a lot in meetings, but once you start writing down, the amount of talk tends to reduce and alignments tend to increase, right? So I have sort of tried this out in the last two large companies that I've worked. I don't do audio meetings at all. As soon as there is a hard strategic decision to be made, I start with first sharing my screen and start writing. So I assume the role of the person who takes minutes of meeting, and I start writing. I've noticed what tends to happen is that people tend to start talking lesser as soon as they know what they are talking is getting written on the screen, and they talk only what's relevant. So this is one cheat that will work for me. Another cheat is that there's going to be people with, as soon as you build your teams, people who are stalwarts in the market, so they would have experience, but ego stemming from that experience, that they really don't know what tends to be the right answer, and would not be basically listen to other people's opinions. So what I have realized is that I let them vent out, saying that ha matlab, you're right, whatever you're saying is right, right? And I start wherever there are disagreements, instead of actively disagreeing with them, I start writing down every place, every point on that same sheet, right? Again, I think this tends to make the meetings extremely well aligned. Um, the third cheat, interestingly, is something that I've realized over a period of time, but people tend to make this mistake a lot, right? They want to brainstorm and prioritize in the same meeting. So what will tend to happen is somebody would say that, hey, I have $2 million to invest, and UPI credit is coming out. Let's figure out how to solve for it. And here's the problem, right? You have already mentioned a specific constraint, that is $2 million. You obviously can't spend more than it, and there are inherent constraints over there. That, hey, this money includes build cost, marketing cost, tech cost, and many other things. And then there are unsaid constraints, right? Like for example, is there a risk to our existing business? Is there a risk, a regulatory risk, etc.? And if you tend to brainstorm and prioritize in the same meeting, right, you end up coming up with very bad solutions to a problem which actually must be one of the top 3, if not like top 10 problems that everybody is trying to go after today in the market. So therefore, always differentiate these 2 meetings. One is a completely creative meeting where you try to come up with solutions. The other is a slightly hacky meeting where you try to come up with a decision. And the last one is an interesting cheat. I have figured out that if you the success of all early stage products, right, depends on locating as many risks as possible as early in the cycle. And therefore, this a lot of y'all might have heard of this term called MISI, right? Mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. The earlier that you do this activity, right, the likely you are at noticing all of your biases in why you have chosen a specific space. Why is it B2B, not B2C? Why is it? Why are you going after 10,000 users, not 100,000? You're right. Noticing all your biases on a visual board makes you very sensitive to why those decisions are made, and sometimes even challenge them with counter decisions. So where did I test them? I have a longer list, but I think I can walk you through a couple of them today. At Dunzo, interestingly, for people who are from Bangalore would know that Dunzo was like, in one line, your on-demand Chotu, right? So it was not the version of Dunzo that is live today. In fact, the version of Dunzo is live today is Swiggy, Instamart, and Zepto. And how did that pivot happen? That was an interesting story. I'll walk you through that today. And another interesting story I can talk you to is more B2B wala. This is Mo Engage. A lot of y'all might work with Mo Engage for marketing automation. and they had this specific business line for web personalization, and they were caught in a dilemma on whether to invest in this business line or not. That was also interesting. And how did that conversation go? And the last one is interestingly very superficial, but I can give you this super interesting anecdote of how I just got called into a meeting early in the morning, and said that there is this startup who's built some savings product, and it's available on the market for $1.5 million. And we have 2 days to decide whether we should buy this or not. And that was also pretty amazing that nobody knew anything about the startup or whether we need this startup or what do we do with these people or the product, but we had to make a decision in lesser than 2 days. So those are some of the diverse areas. Please stop me wherever you all have questions or anything to ask. Okay, let me go ahead. So I'm calling it the Acme framework for lack of a better word. I've also sort of like hacked it through. So there are 4 steps of this process. You first articulate exactly what the problem is, right? And I'm telling you, like a lot of on blogs or workshops or online sort of like design thinking sessions will tell you the same thing. The problem happens to be that most people don't talk about it in a way which is easily understood. So they would have a very complicated definition to what they are trying to solve that effectively impacts their definition of a success metric. Like for example, the one of the startups that I was recently talking to was in the Gen AI, actually is in the Gen AI space. They raised about 200K from Y Combinator, and they had built out a project during their graduation which was about using chat gpt for summarizing large quantities of text. And they had the first use case that had come to their mind are meetings, because they thought that meetings are run really badly. And so they built out that product really fast. Interestingly, they created like a Chrome extension for it, and it got massive adoption early on. I think they got about 20-30K users to use it. And they put on some sort of a monetization play, right? Like, hey, beyond X number of translations, you have to pay us. So they had about 5-7K sort of like USD coming in as their ARR. Here's the problem though. They got caught because the question that we were discussing in the meeting was, can you tell us or can we discuss how to scale, right, this startup? And I was like, what do you mean by scale? And they were saying we are at about 5 to 7K ARR. We need to get to say 100K ARR. And I was like, okay, so but why this particular use case? And they were almost already married to the fact that they wanted to build this product only, right? And after about 45 minutes, I think the three of us, the two co-founders and me, realized that the real problem that they were trying to solve was the fact that they were running out of money. So while raising the money from Y Combinator was a good idea, they had spent almost 7 to 8 months in this process. And when they had talked to their prospective investors, they had told them that we want to see a hockey stick curve in your revenue. And that's where this entire thing about 100K ARR had come. And that led to an interesting conversation, because initially they were only interested in growing their B2C business, and the entire conversation was about gamification techniques, using performance marketing, how do you use segmentation and hacks in the funnel to improve conversion rates, etc. That all changed because then the conversation became, okay, can you get 3 clients who can give you like 30-40K dollars each, right? Because the goal became very clear. So I'm just telling you that the articulation piece looks very obvious, but I've had the most interesting experiences with startups in that space. Like it's not actually as obvious when you are in the middle trying to solve a problem. The second piece is quite interesting, critical questioning. A lot of us do this already, but to do this like outside in, right, where you are actually challenging some of the line items. Like for example, what are the real alternatives to the product that you're building, right? What are the possible areas that this could break? Not now, then probably 6 months down the line, 12 months down the line, or like sometimes asking something as specific as, if you don't do this, what would happen, right? Or if you would do this, what would happen? Something as banal as that can give you insights into reasons why this would not work. And that's interesting because I think all startups have 3 phases, right? like the first part where you actually end up starting up, you need to be overtly optimistic. Otherwise, you would never take the plunge, right? But the second phase is very interesting. That's where you become overtly pessimistic because you want to be as detail oriented in your risk mitigation as possible. And the third phase is again interesting. Once you have decided, what to do and how to do it, you become overtly optimistic again and try to oversell that that dream to everyone so that you can quickly go to market and build the business that you have thought through. So this is the second part. Really, you are very, very pessimistic at this point, and you are trying to figure out, hey, exactly where would this fail? And I'll show you where I had done this with a couple of startups. The messy part is self-explanatory, but I'll show you this through Dunzo on how complex it can become. And the elimination part is self-explanatory, right? Once you've figured out which metric or set of metrics helps you make your decision, 99% of the decisions are not made by selection; they are made by elimination, right? So you don't know what will work, but you're definitely sure what would not work. So the faster you can do that, the faster you make effective decisions. So this was how I had sort of like come up with the framework. So the first one that I'll sort of like go through. Again, I think if you all have any questions at this point, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just jump into the Dunzo case. So Dunzo Daily, I'm not sure how many people have used this product, but it's the same as Instamart and Zepto. So I'm assuming all of us must have used grocery delivery at some point. Dunzo used to always do grocery delivery, but it was more of a marketplace model, and that was the first PMF that we had sort of gotten. In fact, during the 3 years that I was 2 years I was at Dunzo, we managed to change our PMF almost 4 times, right? The first version of the PMF was more on demand. The second version was very specific to some categories. The third version was very marketplace heavy, and the fourth version was very dark store heavy. But the dark store heavy PMF came after some realization. So I'll tell you how this really worked out for us. So it starts off with one morning I come to office, and the CEO calls me and says, hey, we have some major problems that we got to sort of brainstorm. So I was like, hey, what are the problems? And so the idea was never to build a dark store model. And at this point, by the way, there were no dark store models. Even Instamart was not live. So the first problem was the portfolio had negative unit economics, which I think is clear to everybody in the market today also. High defect rate meaning that we had figured out that if an order goes through and no manual intervention is required, that's considered to be a perfect order. But if there is any manual intervention required, that's a defect. And so we had insanely high defect rate, and we had unsustainable growth. Basically, we were burning more than we could make. And he asked me, hey, solve all three problems. And as you can see, this is very random, right? Like at the scale that we were running, and at that point we were running about what, 1 million orders a month, which is not a lot, but it is significant, right? For you to be questioning some core constructs in your business completely. So that's where I started like getting into more critical reasoning. Hey, what has triggered this discussion? Who are the right stakeholders that we should be referring? What is the stack rank between the problems that you're talking about? What is the time frame to put in this change? And while this is just a part, you would notice that the more and more that you go inside, some of the questions become more existential. Like, do we have to display positive unit economics in some parts, or actually become portfolio positive unit economics? The reason that you have to ask these many questions, and I've been trying to productize this into making it useful even without context, and because this is the area where context is the heaviest, right? Maybe at some point I would be able to productize it, but is the meat of the decision making, because this is where you realize what are your constraints, what are your alternatives, what will happen if this goes wrong, what will happen if this goes right, etc. And most answers over here would be a range. Now the answers would be accurately numbers, right? And the more you push people to get numbers, the more likely you are to get to decisions. So that's the third part that I effectively got to, which was defining the problems that he had given me, but in terms of metrics. Like, for example, he said negative unit economics. So I started going into, hey, what is the equation of unit economics? Or high defect rate, what is that equation? Or high unsustainable growth, is there an equation for unsustainable growth? And with each of these equations, started breaking down them into further L2, L3 level sort of like metrics, right? For example, if you have to increase merchant commission, what do? You need to increase AOV. If you have to do that, what do you need to do? You need to change category mix. If that you need to do, what do you need to do in product but not in product? And this is just like a small snippet of the actual strategy. Actually, this was far, far larger than this. But once you start going down this rat hole, there are infinite possible permutations and combinations, as you can see, right? And in each of them, I had to go through breaking down the problem into a sub problem, into a sub problem, and finally into some sort of a solution, right? And then the idea was to like start grouping solutions into, hey, which part of the solutions seem unique, which part of the solution seem, doable, can we bunch them together, etc. And that leads you to the fourth stage. And this, by the way, Misi, it looks quite complicated, but believe me, this is probably the simplest part of this entire framework. Once you've figured out what your core driving metrics are, laying out this entire thing on a mind map takes barely any time, right? Obviously it takes some practice, but not a lot of effort. The first part, which is really defining what is the problem from the ambiguous stage, is hard. And this is the other hard part, right? Like when I had to force down a decision saying that, okay, I have potentially 5 large solutions to this problem that you have put out for me. How do I make, like, how do we make a decision as a team? And had to force them to like decide between three metrics, right? Is it, do we have a cost problem? Do we have a time problem? Do we have an impact or like a GMV or revenue problem? And almost everybody agreed we had all three. And and that's where the hard part is, right? For most startups, you'll realize you're always running out of time. You already have like a hole in your balance sheet on day one, and you have to hit scale fast enough for people to assume that you are valuable enough to be invested in. And fortunately for us, I did manage to get consensus where cost was a major issue. We could not, we had just raised a round and we could not burn more than how much we were burning, considering that I had figured out a different strategy. And that's not in this document, but a very detailed document on how to execute a dark store. First, one dark store in a particular city and then across cities. And because it was not possible to take, I started like breaking it down into metrics where the decision became very upfront, right? Like, and this is like, I think 2017, 18 that we are talking about, 17 actually. And so instead of getting down and building the dark store route, the solution at that time for the company became, hey, if upfront cost is the biggest criteria, can we just solve the existing process and product problems? And that's how the entire roadmap came to be what it came to be. And because this effort was also done, it became very clear to us this is not a long-term strategy. That's how I think this we started looking out for a larger round in the range of 70 to $100 million. And it became clear that the dark store model is the only model that can survive the test of time. So this is one large example. I know it's the context for many of you all must be missing, but the entire point that I'm trying to come to is that you can do it for any small or large problem. So this particular case was pivoting your current business completely from scratch, but it could also be starting a business if somebody wrote you for a 3 million or $4 million check, right? And you don't necessarily have one clear idea, you have probably three clear ideas. And then how do you decide between them? So this format just makes it easier. Some people do it intuitively also. So I mean, some of you all might be fairly more experienced to do it intuitively. But for people who can't or want to teach their teams how to make these decisions and make your company fairly agile in decision making, there these processes or frameworks do work, and I've seen them work. So the idea was to just take you all through one case. There are another two cases, but before we go ahead, I think I've covered meat of what I wanted to talk about. Any questions that you all have at this stage?
Yeah, so for a company like Dunzo, right? Like they've pivoted so many. I'm privy to a lot of internal information also because I was their vendor to them in 2 companies.
Correct.
So I had so I guess and I know them from 2014, 15. I guess that's when
Right.
and they were using tools for the companies I used to work for, and then I was the one who had sold for both, right? And I guess while they had customer NPS, I don't think so. There was a unit economics problem was there from day one, right?
Correct.
Solving that in this format also would not make sense, right? Because, and I guess that's the problem with all these even dark store models. If my own whole thing was that if a business,
So So you're talking about two things. The model does help in decision making because that's the only way. In 2017 we realized that there was no other way in the long term at all. So we had to pivot. The speed of pivoting heavily depended on our ability to raise capital, because we also did like a full model of a dark store and our ops cost, our our capital cost, etc. And we realized that अरे इसके लिए तो पैसा solid लगेगा. So now it became clear what our short term and long term strategy is. Answering your second question of what's happening in the market, etc., the dark store model of delivery is actually profitable, just not at scale, right? Like to give you an example, when I was doing this even back in 2018, and the market has changed significantly since then. When the entire concept was that if you want to become profitable at a store level and then putting potentially at a geofence level and then at a city level, right? Do major considerations change? And the answer was yes, major considerations do change. Your demand and your margin needs to pay for almost all of the store costs, right? But if you look at the economics of the delivery business today, a significant amount of the cost is in the delivery itself. And that's what most people don't talk about, right? And if you're an insider, you would know this, right? Like, so Zepto talks about Zepto very famously keeps talking about their store level profitability, not the fact that they must be incurring something in the range of 70 to 150 and 150. That's the range, okay? 70 rupees to 150 rupees as delivery fees per delivery.
That's
And
a variable cost, which basically
what kind of scale and what kind of margin do you need to sell to recover that kind of cost, right? So but that's possible if you move to a slightly different model, like the big basket model, or you move to geofences which have insanely high demand, right? So you reduce the number of geofences where you're spending on demand, and where your supply and demand are slightly in balance, right? At scale and in balance, I think their profitability is possible. And we had proved this, by the way. I remember before I quit Dunzo, there were 4 geofences across India that we had proved profitability. One of them was in Pune, 2 of them were in Indranagar. And at scale, like I think we were making a healthy like 2-3 crores per month per geofence. So it was not a bad situation. It's just that that's not a small geofence strategy does not necessarily get funded as much as the startups get funded, right? I think it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that thing is out of whack, but the business model does work.
No, I get your point. You're right. It doesn't work at scale. That's the whole thing. And
Yeah.
the variable cost has there is no way to reduce delivery cost because it's people cost. People cost always has an upward trajectory,
Yeah.
effectively in any business for that matter, including manufacturing or whatsoever, right?
Correct.
So that is going to grow higher than inflation, assuming inflation is at 7-8%. That'll be at least 10% increase year on year, unless you figure out a way to optimize it.
Correct.
Which is a very difficult problem in itself.
Absolutely.
So actually, Bhavik, I have a question. Like you mentioned, within Dunzo itself, you went through like 3 to 4 pivots, and you found the PMF with each of these pivots. How do you go about finding PMF that too at such a high frequency, right? Like what has been your funda going to find the right PMF? Because most of the startups here are early stage, they're building the product, they're launching the product. So any thoughts there on how to find the PMF?
So this topic actually is the most debated and heavily written about topic. ऐसा नहीं है कि मतलब if you start searching for PMF, you'll find like 1,000 blogs and videos on it. So there are two that I have come across, and it's interesting though. Like for example, in several companies I've been part of, for example, Hike, right? The experience of the core product had PMF, right? And how do you define that? Typically, most companies would define it by a flattening retention curve, right? That you are no longer leaking and then continuously pushing that retention curve upwards, right? Okay, can I cross sell one more product? Can I get one more person in the network? Can I bring one more use case, right? So it flattens out and then you keep pushing it up, and that's the entire game, right? In building products. But in like Ruchir also said, most sort of operations businesses have a cost component, and therefore there is an economics PMF, right? And like for example, even at Dunzo, right, the early just the usage PMF was insane. Like I'll tell you, when I joined, the company had about 30,000 users, And from there, within 9 months, we got to about 6 lakh without spending a dollar on marketing. Can you believe, like, at some point, all onboarding, like 90% of onboarding was referrals. And that obviously changed. And that's what I call changing PMF, right? From 6 lakh to where we reached later on, it was only performance marketing, like zero referral. Like ऐसा हो गया, पूरा ही flip हो गया है ना?
Yeah.
So the early audience, maybe they found this service really valuable, but the size of that audience, that TAM may have sort of like, be limited. At that point, we didn't realize it was limited, or we believed that अरे नए use cases आते जा रहे हैं. But वो scale पे पता चले, अरे यार ये grow ही नहीं हो पा रहा है, right? Like nobody's coming with more referrals, or most referrals are looking for cashbacks. And at that point, we realized that like growing through referrals was slightly more expensive than growing through performance marketing, and that's how you sort of change. And basis that, you also change your product strategy, by the way. Like the referral audiences are slightly more, how do you say, forgiving also. So because किसी दोस्त ने बोला है ना, so they will spend more time in the product, find a use case. If they don't find a use case, then they have like WhatsApp पे chat कि अरे ये तो चला नहीं, तो दोस्त बोलेगा कि ओ ये try करके देखो, है ना? तो their funnel conversions tend to be better. Performance marketing पे you saw some ad, you came and installed the app. If you did not understand the product in the first 10 seconds, the game is over, right? You ain't gonna come back to the product, and most likely you're gonna uninstall the app. So which means that now you got to change the nature of the product and the business also you're running. So for example, this was like when we started clocking about 1.5 million orders, right? At that time, it became very clear to us that food, which at one point, like at some point, daru was like almost 20%, cigarettes were like at 7%, है ना? And food was like almost 60-70%. At scale, this pivoted, like consumables, which was like grocery and over the counter medication, this became like 70%, and food took a dive. And there were several macroeconomic reasons also why this happened. Like Swiggy also started to over invest in that category, so pura delivery scene hi chala gaya hai na. So but that's how those patterns almost self emerge, right? It's hard to predict them, but sometimes I feel that startups also don't put in that effort to try to predict them. Right,
Also,
because
Bhavik, just to add to your point, right? Then in that case, it should not have scaled to that much volumes without unit economics being sorted, right? Because it's a dangerous path to go down. Predominantly, you're scaling a business to millions of users without having your core unit economics sorted, right? So the mind would the logical mind would say, boss, let's prove it in, which you said, right? 4 geographies, geofences, and then take the next step very calmly versus just going blitzkrieg everywhere.
yeah, but I mean, you all are startups, so you all know this, right? There is no right answer here. है ना? मतलब you are in a market which has enough competition. You have you have enough people with money out there. So either you take that money or you don't take that money. So you eat or you are eaten, right? At that point, you end up taking slightly rash decisions. Logical thinking sort of goes to shit. And, and I have not really come across
Not
that.
really, right? Like, because apart from consumer players, right, which I
Yeah.
believe they have like maybe 2 duopoly or maybe 3 or 4 players or 5 players. In most B2B business, this problem, like at PayU itself, right, you have like 10 people in payments doing sustainably doing the business they are doing, right? Frankly, if you put that lens, right, which Dunzo also started to do, I guess. They opened their logistics arm for other people to piggyback on, if I'm not wrong, at some point in time.
Yeah, no, actually, interestingly, what's not known is this was all that was built in the first year that I joined.
No.
So I spent like the first year building the APIs to make sure that the logistics happen seamlessly. And at the end of the year, we were like, yaar, magar, then we started seeing a trend in the delivery orders only. About 10% of the deliveries were done by restaurant owners. So एक ही इंसान एक महीने में 200 deliveries कर रहा है. I was like, this is a random trend, right? So when we started like looking at that trend, we realized that people want on-demand photos, and that's how we took those APIs that we had built and then we plugged it into our dashboard and we called it Dunzo for Business. So D4B became like a completely different unit. But even there is a choice. Okay, we could have gone down a path saying that D4B is a differentiated and potentially profitable business, and the consumer product is potentially not, although valuations for both of those businesses are different. We could have made like a decision over there also, but hindsight is 2020, I guess. So now what you're hearing in the market is that they are over investing in the D4B business.
Before exactly, I was just going to say it's full circle.
Yeah,
for
it's full circle, but you're right. Like these are not decisions that you can really predict as much. I can tell you this though. At some point, you can sort of preempt failures, you know. Like for example, and this is the example from PayU, right? So this is 2021, and in fact, in 2020, when I had just joined, one of the biggest charters that I had to solve for, which was also complicated, was, hey, we have gone through this merger. We are supposed to hit some cash flow this year, but now we don't have a product because our loans product has been crippled by the situation. And I saw BNPL obviously taking like a major hockey stick growth. At that time, I think the first time is the question had come from outside, like, "Are credit UPI pe kyun nahi chalta?" And this is like much before. So the first product that I had built, which was out in the market in June 2020, was credit on UPI. And at that, which is like much before anybody else had built it out or scaled it to that level. NPCI, in fact, we had a conversation with them, and NPCI had not even thought of this use case. And they said that, chalo, baat karte hai. Like, this is not part of our current, infra plan, and let's figure out. And at that point, for me, and it was do or die, right? I had to show some numbers for process to be convinced that this business should be invested in, right? And that we have green shoots of sort of revenue coming in. So building like a low balance revolve product, front ended by a UPI credit product, was how we managed to get process to get super excited about the India credit business. At that point, that was a known decision, and that was a known risk also. It's not like at that point we did not know that this is in the gray, and at any point NPCI might either go this way or that way. And we were hoping that they would go the way that they would not have a problem with virtual accounts, but eventually they did. Interestingly, by the time they did, 7 other players in the market had just like copied that strategy, and they also fell the same way. Similarly with the cards business, by the way, the credit cards on the prepaid rails wala business, which was Slice, Uni, and all of us, right? Massive scale, right? I think that was in fact one of the large businesses I built the fastest. The product got built in lesser than 4 months, and we released it, and within 3 months we had over about 500,000 users on that product and over 500 crores of spends, right? But again, we knew that this was a gray area. I'll tell you the difference though. Thinking about this actively made us de-risk the business. And this is not well known, by the way, in the market, because PayU raises money from Process internally. PayU is actually completely owned by Process. जिसकी वजह से there isn't a lot of noise about fundraising. We internally raise money every year, obviously. Because of which I think we are also slightly more governance heavy, because there is one owner, right? So several conversations were like, hey, this is a product we are building, this is the opportunity, but there is a gray area. And the questions that they used to ask were, how do you de-risk, right? And we started building a host of other businesses to de-risk. And that was the insight that I'm trying to say. What happens when you like preempt? So what happened eventually is that when RBI came back with these digital lending guidelines, our goals for that year did not get impacted at all, which is very hard to believe, but it's true. In spite of the card business taking off at some incredibly high ramp, right? Like we were seeing incredible spends, like mahine ka like 22-25,000 ka spend on the card, massive revolve, like 50-60% ka revolve chal raha hai na? You're making incredible amount of money. Naspers had promised some 300 or like sort of like 3-digit $1 million investment into this business. But we knew that we have to have like a sort of like balancing play. And what happened is, in the process of building these 2 or 3 credit products, again the Dunzo story, right? I had built out the APIs, and I was like, ये APIs और किसको हमारे पास क्या है? We have the license, we have the tech stack, and this tech stack has amazing throughput and ability to run major TPS. Is there anybody else who's in need of credit, right? And we obviously, the entire consumer game was to go into, hey, maybe Amazon may merchants need credit, right? Or Swiggy may delivery partners need credit, or people need early salary. So this was very clearly a great consumer play to be played. But in the short term, to balance the card business, we built it out with fintechs. So the first person that we approached was Credit B, interestingly, short-term personal loans, and now our APIs power a lot of lending through their platform. In fact, we lend a significant part of their book is powered by us. Also, the commercials were developed in such a way that this was extremely low risk for us and extremely high revenue and net profit. Right, so now that's the reason, right? So we had figured this out ki agar ye chal gaya, if RBI has no concerns at all, this is a blockbuster, right? And we are at the top of this blockbuster because we are sort of incredibly high fire hose of new users coming in from BNPL. So the conversion rate is through the roof. Like we had like major banks coming to us asking us, how did you crack conversion rates at this level? And we were like having those workshops with them. But we also knew agar nahi chala to fir fallback kya hai. This, for example, Dunzo में नहीं किया था, and that's the thing that's playing out.
Super interesting. I think especially the whole BNPL journey of pay credit that you've just elaborated upon, because I think something that we've discussed throughout the accelerator is being in this industry when regulations can constantly impact you. Like, how do you build products or businesses in that environment, right? Like, so I think super interesting to know your perspective on that. I think we can proceed with the rest, Bhavik. I believe you had some more content, right? Yeah.
I think it's mostly the same. There isn't like I'm pretty sure everybody's seasoned enough to be able to do it. The major thing that I'm pretty sure you all do yourselves anyways is, but you have to ask a question is if you have to enable your teams to make some of these hard decisions, right? Like for example, you all grow 3x, 10x, right, in the next 1 year, and you have this problem where you are hiring people and you are in this exact situation. You have potentially like 10 crores to invest, and you're asking this question to some experienced person, and you're trying to make sure that the risk is mitigated. So this entire framework is just to ensure that risks are easily visualized. That's it. Like more than anything else, that's what it does. That nobody is running blind. Everybody knows what the risk is, and once it is visualized, I've seen most people do the right thing. The problem is that when it's not visualized, you are running many blind spots, right? And those blind spots are fueled by obviously market considerations. Like nobody is doing it on purpose to be greedy, but everybody is greedy in a way or two. So this happens, but you can solve this problem by a framework, and this is worked out in several startups where I had an issue where I was not convinced with the strategy, but to convince other people it was really hard verbally, right? Like somebody is outranking you, or somebody has like 2-3 decades of experience. They're not just going to buy the fact that you think that this will not scale, you think that this is a regulatory loophole. So I used to lay out all possible options. Hey, these are the 10 possible options. Now let's, instead of saying that you're wrong, I'm just saying let's take out everything that is wrong. And eventually I think we ended up making relatively correct decisions.
Super insightful actually, because I think all of us are in this situation at different points of time. Yeah. Any other questions, guys?
No, I'll put a question, Bhavik. I saw you were using Whimsical as a tool to, draw those mind maps and all. Any other tools or any other specific, I can say visualizations which you have used and which have added value? If you can talk about that, that will help.
Interestingly though, I do almost everything in mind maps, which is
Okay.
and that has scaled up really well for me. Like for example, at Dunzo and also at Lazypay, right from the strategy document to the user journey to the PRD to the test cases, everything is mind maps. So I'll tell you what it does for me. It allows it allows me to see all possible places of blind spot. मतलब एक तुम feature भी लिख रहे हो ना, so you cannot see why it would potentially not scale. I'll give you an example. This just happened like 2 weeks back. We had a regulatory requirement for a unique customer ID that RBI had asked us for, and it was unique already, but they wanted it in a particular format. And we figured out the short term and the long term fix in the core tech stack. But the teams had not done the pre-mortem. They are not figured out if this goes live, what else can go wrong, right? And eventually what happened is that we had a particular API which is integrated into merchants, which sort of polls for, hey, is this user eligible to get credit, right? There was no way that that API and this had anything related to each other, right? The problem is that because nobody actually wrote out those, white space sort of conditioning ki, अरे ये भी फट सकता है, ये भी फट सकता है, ये भी फट सकता है, and then they cut it out saying that, अरे नहीं, this is bullshit, ये तो नहीं फट सकता, right? Because they didn't do that level of, work, this eventually broke. है ना, मतलब, and in hindsight, when I was talking to the team yesterday, I was telling them, देख ये तो करना चाहिए था, right? And it sounds useless in the beginning, because you're like, अरे ये तो बहुत obvious, ये तो होगा ही नहीं, and so therefore ना, I have realized this is a practice that can just be enforced by founders or CEOs, that you are saying ये तो करना ही है, whether you like it or you don't like it, you will have to do it, and you will see the benefits in the long run. Hopefully you will not have to see the benefits because nothing will go wrong, but in hindsight I've seen that you can preempt several mistakes. So I'm just using mind maps for everything in life at the moment. Apart from that, obviously Figma for most illustrations, etc. But yeah.
So just as a follow-up question to that, suppose you have created a mind map for one particular feature, right? There is a separate mind map for a second feature, right? One of the possible options may be connecting back to the first, probably. Or is it that the two mind maps also are linked to each other?
Yeah, because fundamentally the mind maps also have context, right? Some of them, the starting point defines the context. Like for example, the context can be, अरे मेरे को revenue बढ़ाना है. So this is like business level mind map. Yeah, the context can be from credit assessed to disbursal, there is a major drop. And so we need to figure out all the reasons that's happened. So that's a feature level mind map. Or the context can be that Lazypay पे हमें month to month 3 retention users का बढ़ाना है और average. So it's like a user journey level mind map. So when you do user journey level mind maps, effectively all the features sort of fit in. Because I'm saying the user does step 1, then something, then step 2, then something, then step 3. Because that something are like features and interventions, either comms or offers or sort of promotions, etc. So all of that fits in. And then further, I think in separate mind maps, you talk about the feature itself, right? The feature, its nuances, its cases, so it works out well. I can tell you one thing though, the adoption on this process is really hard because it sounds daunting to begin with. And so I've also had like very mixed success, right? You have to really force people to think like this. Otherwise it doesn't come naturally. Every person on step 1 says, "Arey, ye to obvious hai." And that's the unfolding of this entire framework, by the way.
So I have not used mind maps as such on paper, but I think I'm more on the tech side. So mind maps this is actually what is there somewhere in the mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it makes sense to document it for everyone to be able to not just visualize it but also contribute to it.
Hey Bhavik, yeah, thanks for that. Like it was really good, and it was a good validation because we also take a design first approach. Like if you're not able to see it, you don't know what you are building, right? I have one specific question in terms of, let's say, if we talk about a product, the success metrics can be a little different from who is looking at the product. Let's say a tech team is looking into the product. The success metric can be, okay, I don't want any bug or I don't want any downtime. If a marketing team is looking, it's a different success metric. If a sales team or if a founder is looking, right? So how do you, through this mind map or through this process, how do you, either you capture all the perspective or build a comprehensive one so that everyone is still aligned and we are not spending a lot of time is basically making each other understand? Or have you faced such scenario where there's a heterogeneous set of skill set of people coming in together and working on this mind map?
No, absolutely. I think in specific areas, like for example, for most companies in the fintech space, right, everybody's North Star metric is largely just revenue, right? In very few cases where you're very early stage and you're raising money, you would try to like number of transactions, GMV, number of users. At some point this is vanity, but you hit some cusp or like sab log revenue, profit, right? So that is the dominant decision making in the company. But then like if you say that hey, I want to improve user experience, right, on the product or on the digital product, or I want to change something in the process, make it more automated, and suddenly you're landing in a situation ki yaar ye revenue mein tie back nahi kar raha hai, right? So what's helped me with the mind map situation now is that you're forced into creating these nodes, right? जिसकी वजह से you're forced into coming up with finer, like L1.1 metric, L1.2 metric, है ना? What I've done is that I've assume that a mind map is superimposed now on an Excel file that becomes a model. So, and in many like assume it's a growth model, right? So an example from the previous companies that I was finding it hard to convince people that retention increase by 1% is important to the company, right? Because everybody was focusing heavily on cost per order, right? So only company के 2 quarter का metric खाली cost per order है, तो nobody is focusing on the customer retention. So I had to like lay out the entire model, and then within that model show 1% change. What does it do to your final metric, which is cost per order? In some cases, this is easy to do. In some cases, this is hard to do. But that's the best thing that I've seen to try to get empathy from everyone. Like use the same metric that everybody uses. So if it's revenue, it's revenue. If it's cost, if it's cost. Wherever you find it very hard to attribute those numbers, try to go even further down or connect metrics, right? Like I've not yet come up with a metric which does not connect. Like for example, if you say that your current P99 uptime on your services is 98.5 and you want it to be 99.999, अब ये additional से कितना फर्क पड़ जाएगा, right? And this time, like, how do you define 2 engineers का time spent in just solving that problem? उसमें, like I'll give you an example. This worked out for me, but may not work for you. I created an entire chart of load testing, and then I superimposed my growth model के numbers, and then I proved कि ये देखो week 40 में फट जाएगा. And at that time, I know this was like mota maths. Okay, it had error rate of like over 35%. But at least that brought empathy. Like when I got into a table where मेरे को छोड़ के everybody else was business or sales, right? They're like, oh, okay. Are you saying कि we will have like a situation where we will do no business in 30, 40 weeks? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, what do we do to avoid it? Give me like maybe 20 lakhs and I'll go solve this problem with 2 engineers. They're like, okay, can we fit in this cost somewhere? And as soon as we could fit in the cost, it got funded. So I've realized that even if your maths is not accurate, but your visualization is accurate, you get alignment.
And do you also agree that this really is a process to it can be a discovery process or a process to differentiate between the signal and noise?
It can be, and this is the point, right? Like for example, for every case where you have been able to make the choice of doing something right, you might have really realized it yourself that this was not the right decision.
Yeah.
So that's the choice that you make, right? But without visualizing, I've seen it's just a matter of somebody making a call. जैसे कि we need to move to this new Python में code लिखा हुआ है, हमें Golang में बनाना है, and this is the choice of the co-founder CTO, right? Like now who's going to debate it, right? The problem is that without a framework nobody has a choice, but with a framework somebody is always relating, okay, this change is equal to this number. Everybody gets an equal voice on the table. I think that's the only way to like promote innovation in the team.
And the framework should be also collaboratively built, right? Again, the founder should not push the framework.
But I'm telling you, by far the only thing that I've seen working is that the founder has to force it.
Okay.
I have seen absolutely nobody likes doing this, right? If you can do something by doing less, everybody prefers to do it. कोई किसी को भी ज़्यादा काम नहीं करना है. So unless this becomes like habit in the company that ये तो करना ही है और जल्दी करना है, you may not actually see benefits of a framework like this.
So, thanks, Bhavik. This was a great, presentation. I have a quick question. So, this, in both product use case and business use case, there would be different frameworks, right? So, how do you differentiate, and what sort of frameworks would you use to take decision in, say, a product use case versus a business use case? That's sort of question number one. And question number two is starting point. See, I mean, this mind map thing is something which I have, as you correctly pointed out, very difficult to implement. I have been trying to implement it for myself for years now. I have not been able to do that. Even in my B school, there was a prof from he was from NASA. He used to teach us about this. Professor Rogers would teach us about this, but seriously never been able to implement it. So what is the starting point? How do you start thinking about a problem? and how do you start then moving towards actually building out a mind map? So
that I'll answer the second one. Interestingly, because this is the place where all my conversations with some of these startups have sort of helped. Um, you have to be really honest about the success and failure condition. The version of the story that you tell other people versus the real version of the story is the difference of the starting point. Though whenever, like even in the companies that I worked in, I really forced the CEO to tell me what happens अगर ये नहीं चला तो, what happens अगर 6 महीने में फट गया तो, what happens if we lose $1 million or like $10 million, right? To know those answers gives you the real insight. Why are you doing it? Sometimes it is as shallow as, oh, we need to be seen in the market as doing this product. And then it becomes clear, and then your mind map from then on becomes absolutely clear. Okay, you want to be known as a CEO who has done this. Now clear, अब तो मैं marketing वाले items डाल देगा ना इधर कि this needs to be seen as something, right? Unless it is, oh, we need to solve this particular problem or we need to solve this business metric. So the first part is the hardest part, by the way. I've seen with everyone. Like you start off by saying कि मेरे को ARR बढ़ाना है. Although the main problem is that you're running out of money and actually तुम्हें $5 million उठाना है, because it sounds shallow to say that तुम्हें $5 million उठाना है. But as soon as you sort of within your team say मुझे $5 million उठाना है ना, your answers tend to be different. And also very effective, by the way. Like not like, oh, let's like do this intellectual exercise. नहीं. Crack this sale, hire this person, do this, है ना? And that's the hardest part of the framework. That's why most people don't feel that this framework is easy to implement, because it's not the MECE which is hard. It is just to arrive at why are you doing this and what will happen if you do this.
Understood. Interesting. I think that makes a lot of sense. Thanks. And how about that another question on the product and business? Do you have any insight on that? Is there different from the starting point perspective or thought perspective, that when you build a business related, when you do a business decision making using a mind map is done differently versus when you do a product decision making?
No, absolutely not. In fact, while I was at Dunzo, I used the same framework for the customer support team. Like basically, this was like a really large framework on every type of issue that the customer support team found, and how do we solve for it. And this eventually, by the way, the node of the mind map was we are spending X amount of money on customer support and we need to reduce it. So I had mapped कौन से issue को अगर solve किया तो कितना cost reduction होगा.
Interesting.
So this can be used every which way. Actually, if you think about it, right, mind maps are nothing but Excel files in a visual format.
Yeah, we
So
do
I'm
that.
just like heavily biased on the visual format of this thing. That's why I use it. Otherwise, you can do the same thing in Excel files.
Makes sense. Yeah, but this makes it easier. As you said, buy-in is easy ho jata hai, right? It makes a buy-in overall easy from everybody's perspective, because people can see this.
I have one more question. So, Bhavik, have you run through this at a like very early stage startup, like the case studies or the use case that you shared in your presentation, where like to me they were pretty established and it was more of a pivot or more of a distance. So, have you tried this framework or have you run through the mind map for somebody who's like just starting out, like which most of us are for this particular business?
Yeah, so the example that I gave you in the beginning, this startup called synth.ai, they built out an LLM model, which basically it's listening to your meeting and then it takes the dump, then converts that into text, then summarizes the most important parts, and then depending on different use cases decides what. Like for example, do you only want to find out action items, or do you want to only highlight risks, or do you want to only highlight things that the CEO has said, right? So this was their product. And because they got early success, and this is by the way interesting, right? As soon as you get early success, you are almost married to the solution. It's 6:30, right? So they got $7,000 to $10,000 ka ARR within like 6 months, 8 months, and they were like, "अरे ये सही है, अब इसको scale करना है to 100K." Now whatever they did in the 3 months preceding our chat, right, was not working, because ये B2C use case at that scale था ही नहीं. And so every time they had to scale, they had to pump more money in acquisition. So it became that game, right? Acquire more people and then cross sell some percentage of those people, and that's the only way to increase your revenue, right? When this conversation happened, they had approached me only saying that, hey, have you found out other ways of effective growth, right? Will referrals work over here? Will this work over here? And when the conversation became about, hey, what are you really looking for? The conversation was that we are looking for a $10 million check to serve. To basically, we are hearing in the market ki अरे ऐसे funding winter है तो 10 million चाहिए. It needs to last us for like 3 years or 2.5 years. Like, okay, so what are these people looking for? Have you actually gone and asked one of these investors, what would I have done for you to write a check for me like that? They had not done that conversation. And so I said, उन्होंने passing में क्या बोला? Did they like mention there are other alternatives in the market that are comparables to you, etc., etc. So वो conversation में it became clear that they were looking for sustainable revenue models. In fact, the guys at Y Combinator also told them something similarly. Actually, Y Combinator is quite famous to promote B2B over B2C models, right? So that's when we finally summarize saying that their tech and their product is solid, but the use case can change. So they are in the process of doing that. Like, for example, in the conversation, we realized that the entire collections use case for credit businesses is amazing. Like the QC that's done in some of these businesses where telecallers are involved is really bad. There aren't many established tools out there with great experience. Like तुम एक particular user crack करोगे, maybe that's like a $50,000 contract, है ना? And that, but that was hard for them because they had always thought of this business as a B2C business. So it was becoming like a huge challenge to like disconnect their view of their own business and say that nahi, we are going to pivot and become B2B. But eventually they made that call. So this is like very early, like it was like the 6th or 8th month, had raised $150,000 from Y Combinator, were looking to raise $5 to $10 million ka check. So it was that early.
So, do you think the process helped or a different perspective which you brought in helped?
Now here's the nuance, right? Like the way that I look at it, I think they could have come up with it themselves. But in a way, what you're saying is also right. Like maybe they were so married to what they were doing, they just could not see the other version of the story. So when I came in and started asking questions, which was slightly how do I say, simpleton types, मेरे को business नहीं पता था, तो मैं obvious questions पूछ रहा था, और जब वो obvious answers देने लगे, तो it became clear that the answer was not right because the question itself was not right. So yeah, it does work now. I don't know how I'm because I'm from the product space, I tend to believe everything can be productized. So I'm like spending time trying to productize it. Maybe that's my blind spot and maybe it can't, but time will tell. I think I'll talk to more people and maybe I'll see some trends. Right now you can maybe just use consultants, like people who don't know what you're doing, and maybe they can just ask you hard questions to force you out of your obvious beliefs.
So, Bhavik, when you think about a product, right, from a feature perspective, so do you take insights from the ground? Or do you depend upon the questionnaire surveys and all that you take it from the end, or how much percentage of insights coming from those channels is taken care of when you're thinking about a product design?
No, that's very interesting. And sometimes actually first party user research is in product purists has made a lot of big deal about. Actually 4 different channels here, right? There is first party user research, there is competitor research, there is market research, and then there is weirdly but not really thought through that interestingly is internal research. Like कभी ना कंपनी के खुद की औकात नहीं रहती है कुछ बनाने की, but सपने बहुत बड़े रहते हैं. So until you don't document that also, you don't even realize that, hey yaar, this is a product that I can't build just because I don't have the capability to build it. So I do all 4, right? And there is always one pivot somewhere, or one spike somewhere. Like somewhere, for example, if you have enough data that your competitor or groups of competitors are making money in this space, and you just have one thing differently solved. Like for example, they may have solved monetization and user experience, and you may have solved distribution, and then you realize, oh shit, on my distribution ramp I can build the same product with absolutely different, no changes at all, right? I don't need to innovate the product itself. So you can have such plays. So effectively I've realized that in products which are like commoditized, right, you need to like crack distribution. So that's what you think, right? And places where distribution is hard to crack, you need to work on the product and pricing, right? That needs to be differentiated. You can clearly make like a 2x2 of this also, but I'm just saying that it can be it's not impossible to look at the business like this. Did it answer your question though?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, different perspective. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Bhavik. I think very engaging session, very interesting. I think like in different domains of fintech, different domains of businesses, everybody is facing these challenges. In fact, I think people have asked for a workshop on mind maps from you. So I don't know if yeah, so I don't know
We
if
want
that's
it.
possible, but I think if the founders can reach out
I'd
to
love
you straight
to, I mean, also selfishly, because I want to keep testing this framework. If there is anything that you all need in terms of one-on-one help, also, I'd be more than happy to. There would obviously be a lot of overlap between what we do and what you all do. So use your discretion as much as possible. But on that other side, wherever there is an overlap, actually, there may be an opportunity as well. So for all of you who know about PayU, number one, PayU is one of the fintechs which is largely open to partnerships, right? Like, in fact, like I just told you how we thought about our business, it was very partnership led. STPL, short-term personal loans, is a product I was building myself, right? There was no reason for me to build APIs and then fund my competitor. But sometimes you do things for the sake of building scalable businesses. So we are open to that. Second is that we do have deep distribution modes, right? On the merchant side, on the consumer side, obviously. And in some cases, some of your products might be interesting complements to our product and can help both your product and our product grow. So we'd be more than happy to listen to you. And the third interesting part is a lot of y'all do know that PayU also has an investment arm, right? Like, and we do discretionary investments. It's not like VCs की हम लोग को 50 startup में 200 K डालने का है. But when we find a couple of good startups, the checks tend to be large in size, like multiple millions of dollars. In fact, the if BillDesk had gone through, that would have been the biggest acquisition, right, for $4.7 billion. But before that had happened, actually, the company that I'm part of today was an outcome of several tranches of checks followed by like a large check, right? They had invested in Series B, Series C, and then eventually at Series E they came in and said that, hey, yaar, matlab, why don't you just, instead of building like a small startup in Mumbai, just merge these three startups and build something big. So that was $185 million check. So and PayU does this very often, by the way. Like if you just read up, there are several startups and across the world, like in remittance, in DeFi, payments mein to obviously across the world, credit mein several places. Now looking at vertical payments plays, that's a big area of interest to PayU as well. And I specifically look at consumer plays, right? Somebody's doing something with using AI for better categorization of financial information, or can I use some information about using savings for credit, or like an overlap product, etc., etc. So there's a lot of places that we can work together. But apart from that, I can just have one-on-one conversations. If you can use me like this sounding board, right? I know nothing about your business. So if you want to have someone come in and ask dumb questions for an hour, I can do that.